The barn door creaked open on a hinge of ice, a sound like an old bone snapping. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the sliver of winter light as Boaz McKinnon slid through the gap. The cold followed him in, a hungry ghost chasing the trapped warmth of hay and horsehide. He was early. He was always early. The sun was still a rumor behind the jagged peaks, but he'd already been up for hours, his quiet routine a shield against the grief that never slept. He was just here to buy a workhorse, a simple transaction, nothing more. He moved down the narrow corridor, his boots whispering in the straw. The scent of sweet feed and manure hung thick in the air. A dapple gray mare watched him from her stall, her dark eye a liquid pool of knowing. He was a man accustomed to silence, who wore it like a second coat. He didn't offer words and didn't expect them in return. He was halfway down the row when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the stamp of a hoof or the jingle of a harness. It was breath, human breath. A ragged, desperate sound, too thin for the biting cold. He stopped dead. Every nerve ending screamed. He didn't call out. He didn't make a sound. He just moved, slow and deliberate, around the edge of the last stall. And that's where he saw her. Slumped against the back wall, half hidden by a stack of hay bales, was a woman. Her wrists were bound tight with baling twine, the fibers digging into her skin. Her face was a canvas of fading bruises, her lips split, her eyes swollen nearly shut. But through the swelling, those eyes burned with a fire that hadn't been put out yet. A tattered cotton dress, torn at the shoulder, hung off her frame. Her feet were bare, her ankles raw and scabbed. But her back was ramrod straight. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, a look that said she'd seen too many men like him and trusted none of them. Boaz didn't speak. He just let out a slow breath through his nose and crouched down. She flinched, a tiny violent jerk, as he reached for the ropes on her wrists. Before his fingers could touch the knot, a sound scraped behind him. The arrogant rasp of spurs on a stone floor. "Well, hell," a voice drawled. "Too smooth for this part of the country. Look what the cat dragged in, an early bird." Harlan Price stood there, a man polished to a high sheen. Trim coat, boots that mirrored the gloom, and silver hair slicked back with an air of practiced superiority. He didn't even glance at the woman, stepping past her as if she were a pile of soiled straw. "The horse is a fine beast, McKinnon," Price said, gesturing to the next stall. "Strong back, steady feet. But you came on the right day. I'll even sweeten the deal." Boaz didn't stand up. His gaze was fixed on the raw red lines around the woman's wrists. With fingers that were surprisingly nimble, he began to work at the knots. They were tight, meant to hold. Price clicked his tongue, a sound of mild annoyance. "She's part of the sale," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Call it a bonus, a little something extra for your trouble." Boaz kept working, his focus absolute. The first loop of the twine came loose. "She's a runaway," Price continued, his tone hardening slightly. "Claimed she was looking for her kin. Turns out she ain't got no kin. Found her sleeping in my stables 2 weeks back. Been feeding her, keeping her out of the wind. A lonely thing like that, you know how it is. Someone's got to make her choices for her." The rope finally fell away. Boaz stood up, slow and deliberate, the frayed twine still clutched in his fist. He turned to face Price, and his voice was flat, cold, and heavy as a block of granite. "She yours?" Price let out a short, sharp laugh. "Come on now, McKinnon. Don't be difficult. I'm offering you a bargain. You want the horse or not?" Boaz didn't move a muscle. He just repeated the question, his eyes boring into Price. "She, yours." The silence in that barn suddenly felt thick enough to choke on. The dapple gray mare snorted, the only sound in a world that had stopped breathing. Price's smug grin faltered. "She's in my care," he finally spat out, his eyes darting away. Boaz didn't blink. He didn't need to say another word. He just stepped back, turning slightly, and offered his hand to the woman. She stared at it for a long moment, her gaze flickering from his hand to his face, searching for the trap. She didn't take it, but she did get to her feet, slow and stiff, wincing as blood rushed back into her legs. Without a word, she walked out of that stall. She walked barefoot on the cold, dirty straw, right past Harlan Price, and stood beside Boaz. They didn't take the horse. They didn't say goodbye. They just took the cold and walked out into the pale, unforgiving light of dawn. The wind had picked up outside, sharp as a razor's edge. As they walked toward Boaz's wagon at the edge of town, the world was beginning to stir. Curtains twitched in windows. Eyes peered out from behind frosted glass. The gossip started like a slow drip, then a trickle, then a flood. A man like Boaz McKinnon didn't bring home strange women. Not ever. And a woman like that, bruised and barefoot, didn't belong anywhere decent. She sat huddled under a thick wool blanket in the back of his wagon, her body curled into a tight knot of misery and defiance. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. They just rode in silence, the creak of the wagon wheels the only sound between them. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the horizon, like a woman who had seen far too much of the world behind her and didn't dare to dream of what lay ahead. The cabin was small, nestled in a grove of frost-covered pines. Boaz opened the door, lit the lantern, and let her enter first. The hearth was cold stone, but he laid the kindling with practiced hands and struck a flint. The fire caught, slowly at first, then bloomed into a steady, hungry flame. She stood in the middle of the room, her eyes darting everywhere, mapping the exits, calculating the odds. He saw it, but said nothing. He set a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese on the small wooden table, warmed a pot of coffee on the new fire, and sat across from her. He waited. Not for her story, not for thanks, just for her to eat. And she ate like a starving wolf, tearing at the bread with a desperate hunger. But her gaze never lost its pride. She chewed every bite with a fierce dignity, as if daring the world to take this small comfort from her too. He slid a folded blanket across the table toward her. She flinched, her eyes wary, before her fingers brushed against the rough wool. She pulled it into her lap but didn't lie down. Not yet. Not in this strange man's house. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, Boaz stood outside, checking the latch on his own small barn. His breath plumed in the frigid air, white smoke against the dark backdrop of the pines. There had been no payment exchanged, no deal struck, no promises made. Just a woman in a stall, and a man who couldn't leave her there. Back inside, the fire crackled and spat, and she watched the flames as if they were telling her a story in a language she had almost forgotten. Boaz sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall, blanketing the fence that had once marked the edge of his own sorrow. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a border. It felt like a beginning. And he had a strange feeling, a feeling he hadn't had in years, that this was something worth staying up to see. The first morning, she still hadn't spoken a word. Boaz found her on the porch at dawn, curled up on the bench, the wool blanket pulled tight around her as if she expected someone to rip it away at any moment. Her bare feet hovered just above the frosted boards, as if she couldn't bring herself to trust the ground beneath her. He didn't ask what she was doing out in the freezing cold. He just handed her a tin mug of coffee, the steam a fragile prayer in the pale light. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered hills, watching for something he couldn't name. She took the mug with both hands, warming them on the heat, but she didn't drink. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Inside, the fire he'd fed all night still burned bright. She had eventually fallen asleep on the floor in the corner, cocooned in the same blanket, refusing the bed in the other room. It was as if she'd decided she belonged nowhere, so any corner would have to do. That morning, he left her bread and eggs and a basin of clean water before heading out to mend a fence in the north pasture. When he returned at midday, the food was gone and the basin was empty. But the woman wasn't in the house. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He found her in the barn, sitting in the hay in the very same stall where he'd found her. She wasn't hiding. She was just staring at the dust motes dancing in a single beam of sunlight that pierced the gloom. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts. It swallowed her whole. Her own tattered dress, now rinsed clean, hung from a nail, dripping silently onto the straw. He knew then that she meant to leave. She just hadn't left yet. Later that afternoon, she lit the stove herself. She moved through his small kitchen with a quiet purpose, opening cupboards, finding a pan, cracking 2 eggs into it. Her hands were still bruised, but they were steady. The smell of frying eggs filled the small cabin, a simple domestic sound that felt alien in the tense silence. She placed the plate in front of him without a word. He nodded once, a small dip of his chin. She retreated to the far side of the room, by the window, her arms crossed tight against her chest, as if kindness were a weapon she needed to shield herself from. He took a bite of the eggs. They were good. He took a sip of water. The silence stretched. Delaney. The word came out of his mouth before he could stop it, quiet as a whisper. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. His gaze was steady, not pressing. "Is that your name?" he asked. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy with things unsaid. Then, barely louder than a breath, she answered, "Yes." The sound of her own name, spoken aloud, seemed to crack something open in the room. Not the walls. Something smaller, quieter, something closer to the heart. She didn't say anything more. She just turned her head and watched the last of the daylight bleed from the sky, setting the snow-covered hills on fire. That evening, they had a visitor. A sharp knock at the door, and before Boaz could answer, it opened. Ida McCrae stood on his doorstep, a tall, wiry woman with silver hair braided down her back and a sage-green shawl that had seen more hard winters than most folks in town. She carried a basket with thread and sugar, things Boaz hadn't asked for. Her sharp eyes flicked to Delaney, who was huddled by the fire, looking small and fragile. Ada's expression didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "Well," she said, her voice raspy as dry leaves. "The wind's turned mean." She set her basket on the table. Boaz nodded. "It'll be a hard freeze by morning." Ada's gaze lingered on Delaney. "She staying long?" Boaz didn't answer. Delaney answered for him, her voice surprisingly strong. "Just till I figure where to go next." Ada raised a single skeptical eyebrow. "Plenty of folks in town are trying to figure the same thing about you." Delaney's jaw tightened. "I'm not folk." "No," Ada agreed, her eyes missing nothing. "But they'll talk about you like you are." And she was right. The next morning, when Boaz rode into town for salt and oats, the talk had already bloomed like black frost on the window panes. The quiet man, the widower, the man who kept to himself, had taken in a strange woman. A bruised, barefoot runaway with no name and no family. The whispers followed him into the mercantile, curling around him like smoke. Deputy Bixby, a man with a perpetually worried expression, cornered him by the pickle barrel. "Boaz," he said, trying to sound casual. "Just checking if you need any help out at the ranch." "No," Boaz said flatly. The deputy leaned in closer. "Just want to make sure she's there of her own free will." "She is." "Because," Bixby continued, his voice dropping. Harlan Price came into my office this morning, madder than a wet hen. Claims she owes him for room and board. Says she ran off with some of his money. Boaz didn't even look at the man. He just hefted the sack of oats onto his shoulder and walked out, leaving the deputy standing there with his mouth half open. When he got back to the cabin, Delaney was gone. Not just from the house, but from the barn, too. A surge of cold panic, something he hadn't felt in years, gripped him. He found her behind the woodshed, kneeling in the frozen dirt, her bare hands pushing aside the snow. She was planting something, in rows too straight to be random. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't look up. "There were seeds in the pantry," she said, her voice muffled. "For the spring." Her voice caught. She kept her eyes fixed on the cold, hard earth. "I don't know where I'll be come spring." He crouched beside her, close enough to see that she was trembling, not just from the cold. "You can stay here." She shook her head, a violent, angry motion. "I ain't yours to keep." "I didn't say you were." The frozen soil clung to her fingers like a shroud. "People will say things," she whispered. "They already are." She finally looked at him, her eyes old and tired. "Why are you being kind to me?" He didn't have an answer for her. Not then. He just stood up, brushed the dirt from his own hands, and went back inside. When he returned, he was carrying a pair of his old work boots. The laces were frayed, the leather scuffed and worn, but they were solid. He'd walked every inch of his property line in them for 6 years. He set them down on the snow beside her without a word. Delaney stared at them for a long time, then reached out and touched the worn leather, as if she didn't deserve something so sturdy. Then, slowly, she slipped her bare feet inside. A week passed. A quiet, fragile truce settled over the small cabin. She started sleeping in the bed. He never asked her to. She never thanked him for it. One night, as they sat by the fire, she reached for his late wife's sewing basket. He flinched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. Her hand froze over the basket, the needle and thread suddenly feeling like stolen goods. "I can put it back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stared at the thread, trembling slightly between her fingers, and a memory, sharp and painful, pierced through him. "No," he said, his voice thick. She would have liked to see it being used. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound, Delaney began to sing. It was just a hum at first, an old half-forgotten tune, the kind of lullaby mothers sing to their babies on stormy nights. The simple melody filled the cabin, pushing back against the darkness and the cold. Boaz didn't move. He didn't even look at her. He just listened. When she finished, the silence that followed was warm and comfortable. "My wife," he said, his voice quiet, "used to sing that song when the pipes froze." Delaney didn't reply. She just hummed the tune again, softer this time, like a prayer whispered into the dying embers of the fire. The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. The sound of a horse riding up the drive, too fast, too aggressive, sent a jolt of alarm through the cabin. Delaney looked out the window and her face went pale. She stumbled back, as if she'd been struck. "He's here," she whispered. Boaz was on his feet and out the door before she could say another word. Harlan Price swung down from his horse, his polished boots sinking into the mud, a predatory grin stretching his lips. "You come for the horse?" Boaz asked, his body a solid wall between Price and the cabin door. Price brushed an invisible piece of dust from his coat. "I've come for what's mine." Boaz didn't move. "You have papers?" Price's grin widened. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "Signed and sealed. By her kin. Her stepbrother gave me full rights of labor exchange. She's my property until her debt is worked off." Boaz took the paper. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he folded it, smaller and smaller, and tucked it into his own coat pocket. "She ain't property." "She ran," Price snarled, his voice rising. "That's a breach of contract. I could have the law on you for this, McKinnon. For theft." "Then do it." For the first time, Price's confidence wavered. His grin cracked. "She ain't worth the trouble," he spat. "You'll see. She'll run from you too. That's what girls like her do. It's all they know." Boaz turned his back on him and started walking toward the cabin. "Then I'll run too," he said without looking back. Price left, his horse kicking up mud and snow as he galloped away. But the threat he left behind hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Delaney didn't sleep that night. Neither did Boaz. He sat in his chair by the hearth, and she sat by the door, a silent, watchful sentinel. When the first gray light of dawn touched the window, she stood up. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table, pulled on the old work boots, cinched her coat tight, and walked out the door with her head held high. The note was short, just a few words scrawled in charcoal on a piece of brown paper. "Thank you for never asking me to smile." By the time he read it, she was already a small, determined figure, walking down the road toward town. She wasn't walking like someone running away. She was walking like someone who was finally deciding where her own story would go next. And that was something he understood all too well, because he had once walked away from his own life, not to escape it, but to find a way to live with it. And now it was her turn. The snow turned to a vicious, stinging sleet that week. It coated every tree branch in a thick layer of ice and turned the road to town into a treacherous ribbon of misery. Delaney didn't come back the first day, or the second. Boaz didn't go looking for her. But every morning, he found himself standing on the porch, his eyes scanning the empty road, a hollow ache in his chest. He left her coat hanging on the peg by the door, not because he expected her to return, but because he wasn't ready to accept that she wouldn't. 3 nights after she'd left, he heard a knock. It wasn't a timid knock or a frantic one. It was just there. He opened the door, and she was standing on his porch, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her fingers blue with cold. Her eyes weren't searching his for welcome or forgiveness. They were just looking for a space to occupy. An unspoken question hung in the freezing air between them. Would he let her in again? He stepped aside without a word. She walked past him, dripping a trail of melted sleet on the floorboards. He handed her a dry towel. She didn't thank him. She just dried her hair with rough, angry motions, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and even. Delaney peeled off the damp coat and let it fall to the floor. "I asked Ida for work." Boaz nodded once. "She turned you down?" "No," Delaney said, her voice flat. She sank into the chair by the hearth, her body trembling. "She gave me a needle and 2 shirts to mend. Didn't ask a single question. Just watched me, like she already knew all the answers." The silence in the room was broken only by the hiss and crackle of the fire. Boaz poured a cup of hot tea and set it on the small table beside her. She didn't reach for it. She just stared into the flames. "She said there's a price for being seen," Delaney whispered. Boaz leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed. "And you?" "I haven't figured out if I can afford it yet." The wind rattled the window panes, a restless, angry sound. "Price found me," she added, her voice dropping even lower. Boaz's jaw tightened. "He tried to grab my arm, right there on the street. Said I made him look like a fool. Said if I wanted to eat in this town without his permission, I better find some papers to prove I ever existed." "Did he hurt you?" No, she said. A long beat of silence. Not this time. Boaz took the kettle off the stove and poured a second cup of tea, setting it beside the first one. She still didn't touch it. He watched her for a long time before he spoke again. You're safe here. She shook her head slowly, a weary, defeated gesture. Nobody's safe, Boaz. They're just tolerated, or they're gone. The fire popped, sending a shower of embers up the chimney. They cracked like knuckles. She stared into the flames, as if waiting for them to confess something. That night she didn't sleep in the bed. She took her old spot on the floor by the fire. It wasn't out of fear this time. It was something else. A kind of penance, maybe. A refusal to accept a comfort she felt she hadn't earned. Boaz left her be. The next morning, he found her outside splitting wood. Her coat was hanging open, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her swings were wild and sloppy, but fueled by a fierce, violent determination. He approached her slowly. She didn't stop. You're going to break your wrist, he said. I ain't breaking, she snarled, bringing the axe down with a grunt. I'm just burning. He reached for the axe. She jerked it away from him, her eyes blazing. Delaney. She stared him down, her jaw clenched, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the fight went out of her. She dropped the axe. It fell into the snow with a dull, heavy thud. Her shoulders slumped, and she curled in on herself, as if the weight of her own rage had finally become too much to bear. He picked up the axe, but he didn't swing it. He just held it, the weight of it familiar in his hands. You ever had something done to you for so long, she whispered, her voice cracking, that even when it stops, you still wake up choking on it? Boaz didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent witness to her pain. I don't want to be scared anymore, she said. He nodded once. Then stop swinging like someone else's ghost is in your arms. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded more like a sob. You think I can just let go of it? That easy? No, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I think you've already started. That night she cooked cornbread and stew. She didn't ask permission. She just took over the kitchen, moving with a new kind of confidence, as if she were carving out a space for herself, one spoonful at a time. Boaz sat at the table and watched her. After they ate, she picked up the sewing basket and resumed her work on a half-mended sleeve. The thread slid smoothly through her fingers now, steadier than before. You ever think of leaving? Boaz asked, breaking the comfortable silence. For good. Delaney's eyes didn't lift from her work. Every day, she said, until you untied my hands. And now, she paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. Now, I'm thinking. He nodded. That's more than most folks ever do. The next day, she walked back into town. This time her shoulders were squared, her hair was pinned back, and she wore the flannel shirt tucked into a skirt she had hemmed to fit. It didn't matter that it was patched and worn. It fit her like a flag. A quiet, defiant flag that refused to be taken down. People stared, but this time she stared back. Ida was waiting for her. She gave her a table in the back of the shop and a fresh pile of mending. All she said was, "Your hands look steady." They were. A week went by. Price kept his distance, but the whispers in the town grew louder. They said Boaz was living in sin with a woman who didn't belong, that she was nothing more than a piece of property he'd stolen. Boaz ignored it all until Deputy Bixby showed up at his door again. He rode in slow, his hat tipped low, his voice quieter than usual. Boaz, he said, not meeting his eyes. There's talk. There's always talk. This kind's different. It's louder. They're saying you stole property. Boaz just stared at him. She's not property. It doesn't matter what she is to you, Boaz. What matters is that Harlan's bringing the law into it. The circuit judge. Boaz folded his arms across his chest. Then let him. He will, Bixby said, his voice strained. And he'll have court papers. You're going to need proof she was mistreated. She was tied up in a stall. Did you see it? Bixby asked, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Boaz's silence was answer enough. The deputy sighed, a long, weary sound. It ain't about the truth, Boaz. It's about who the folks in this town choose to believe. When Bixby left, Delaney was waiting on the porch. She'd heard enough. She knew the rhythm of injustice all too well. I'll go, she said, her voice flat. I won't be the reason you get dragged through the mud. You didn't drag me anywhere. I don't want to be the reason your neighbors spit on the ground when they see you. They already do, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It just used to be for other reasons. Delaney looked down at her hands, at the faint scars that were beginning to form over the rope burns. It's never going to end, is it? Boaz was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, his voice soft, Do you want it to? Her eyes, filled with a new, hard-won strength, rose to meet his. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded papers Harlan had given him, the ones signed by her stepbrother. They were crumpled and smudged with dirt, but the ink was still dark. I didn't burn these, he said, because I knew that one day you would want to. She stared at the parchment, the legal document that had defined her, that had nearly destroyed her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Then her fingers closed around it, and the shaking stopped. She walked to the fire, knelt down, and held the edge of the paper to the flames. It caught slowly, curling inward, as if it was afraid to destroy something that had been feared for so long. When it was nothing but black ash drifting up the chimney, she watched every last piece disappear. Boaz watched her. When she turned to face him, her face wasn't smiling, but it was free. Not healed, not whole, but no longer pretending to be broken. That night she sang again. It wasn't a lullaby this time. It was an old folk song, a tune with words about a river and a woman who had to cross it alone. Her voice cracked in places, but she didn't stop. Boaz sat on the porch, listening. When she finished, he didn't say a word. He just tipped his head and, for the first time, he said her name like it was something more than just a name, like it was a promise. Delaney. She turned to look at him. I don't need you to stay, he said, his voice quiet but clear. But I'd like to build you a room if you do. She blinked, not with surprise, but with a kind of deep, quiet recognition. Then, with a voice as soft as falling snow, she said, Boaz, I never asked to be rescued. I know, he said, but I wouldn't mind being remembered. He nodded once, then went to fetch his hammer. And that's how the fire really started. Not with a spark, but with two broken people deciding to build a wall together. A wall that was meant to hold in the warmth, not keep out the world. The sky over town that morning was the color of a fresh bruise, swollen with snow that refused to fall. The light was thin and gray, hushing the world in that strange, expectant silence that comes right before a storm or a reckoning. Delaney walked down the center of Main Street, wearing Boaz's late wife's red coat. The hem brushed against the tops of her boots. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes fixed forward. And people stared. They stared not because she looked wild or broken anymore, but because she didn't. They stared because she didn't lower her gaze. They stared because she had the audacity to walk through their town as if she belonged there. The coat didn't fit her perfectly. It clung to her frame as if it remembered another woman, another life. But it was warm and, in a way, it was hers now. Not a gift, but a trophy. Proof of survival. She walked past the mercantile, the post office, the church with its silent, sleeping bell. Eyes followed her from every window, from behind every twitching curtain. The whispers chased her like dry leaves in the wind. That's the one that ran from Price. I heard she's got that quiet rancher twisted around her finger. She was nothing but a stray when she got here. She's still nothing. Delaney didn't flinch. Her face was a mask of calm dignity. She turned and walked into Ida McRae's shop, the small bell above the door jangling like an alarm. Ida looked up from her counter, glanced at the clock on the wall, and then nodded toward the pile of mending waiting in the back. "You're early," she said. "I had something to prove," Delaney replied. She shrugged off the red coat and folded it neatly over the back of a chair. Ida watched her with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "You'll have to prove it again tomorrow." "I plan on it." The quiet in the small shop was absolute. Outside, the murmurs of the town grew louder, more insistent. The reckoning came around noon. Harlan Price strode into town, not angry, not rushed, just filled with a calm, slick righteousness, as if he owned the very ground he walked on. He saw her through the shop window. His face darkened. He marched to the door and threw it open, the bell screaming in protest. "There you are," he snarled. Delaney froze, her needle hovering in midair. Ida slowly set her scissors down on the counter. "You think you can humiliate me?" Price bellowed, his voice filling the small space. "You think you can just walk around in that coat, like you didn't steal from me? You're still mine, girl, and you will be until I say you're not." Delaney rose from her chair, not quickly, not with a tremor, just a slow, deliberate unfolding. "I am not yours," she said, her voice low and steady. He lunged for her, his hand outstretched, not a touch, but a grab. The door opened again. Boaz. He stood there in his canvas coat, his hat dusted with snow. His hands were empty, but his presence filled the doorway, a silent, immovable force. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stepped between Price and Delaney. "She told you no." "She's a liar and a thief," Price spat, his face contorted with rage. "She's free," Boaz said, his voice as quiet and as dangerous as a coiled snake. "She's a stray," Price scoffed, "and you're no better, keeping her like a dog and calling it charity." Boaz just stared at him, his expression unreadable, that endless, unnerving quiet, his only armor. "Then why," he asked softly, "are you so scared of her walking through town?" A crowd had gathered outside now, their faces pressed against the glass, no longer pretending it wasn't their business. "I have a signed paper," Price blustered, fumbling in his coat. "A legal claim." "And I," a new voice cut in, "saw you drag her into that stall 2 months ago." Etta stepped out from behind her counter, her eyes like chips of flint. "She had no shoes, and you bolted the door from the outside." "That's slander," Price roared. "Then sue me," Etta said calmly. "I saw you pass an envelope to the deputy," another voice added. Mrs. Norling from the bakery stood in the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour. Looked like a few dollars more than a horse's worth. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Price hissed. Boaz's voice was dangerously quiet. "You already did." The bell jingled again. Deputy Bixby stepped inside, a ledger tucked under his arm, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He wouldn't look at Boaz. He wouldn't look at Price. He just cleared his throat and announced to the room, "I have new orders from the circuit judge. He reviewed the affidavit." He looked down at his ledger. "Harlan Price, you're to come with me." Price's mouth fell open. He looked around the room, a wild, panicked look in his eyes, searching for an ally. But no one stepped forward. Not the grocer, not the pastor, not even the law he thought he'd bought and paid for. He was alone. Delaney didn't smile. She didn't say a word. She just watched as the man who had haunted her every waking moment seemed to shrink, becoming nothing more than a small, pathetic man who couldn't stand the light of day. Boaz turned to her. He held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. Outside, the town was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of reckoning. Ida went back to her counter. Mrs. Norling went back to her bread. Life went on, but something fundamental had shifted. Delaney picked up the red coat and folded it over her arm. She walked out into the street, not hiding, not running. Boaz followed, a step behind, not as her guard, as her equal. When they reached the wagon, the snow finally began to fall, soft and gentle, like a blessing. She paused, her hand on the rail, and looked out at the horizon where the gray sky met the white fields. Then she turned to him. "Why did you follow me that day?" she asked. He took a long, slow breath. "Because some things don't need a reason," he said. "Just a right moment." She nodded. They didn't ride home right away. They just stood there in the falling snow, letting the cold bite at their cheeks, letting the silence settle around them, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of promise. The day Delaney decided to stay for good, the sky broke open. Snow fell thick and silent, a clean white sheet thrown over the sins of the world. It covered every fence post, every roof shingle, every splintered board in the barn that had once been her prison. By midday, the land looked as if it had been baptized, hushed and holy, in a way only a deep winter snow can make it. She stood by the fence, her breath a white cloud in the air, watching the hills dissolve into the white sky. Boaz was nearby, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the silent world. Neither of them spoke. Words had started to feel like clumsy, unnecessary things between them. She didn't have to tell him she was staying. He saw it in the small things. The way she had unpacked the last of her meager belongings, a small tin comb, and set it by the wash basin. The way her boots were set to dry by the fire, tucked in next to his, not by the door. The way she had started stitching new curtains from an old linen sheet, with no pattern, just instinct. Small, quiet declarations of permanence. That evening, she found him in the barn. He was hammering a new, clean beam into the frame of the stall where he had found her. "You fixing it for a new horse?" she asked, her voice soft. He stopped hammering and turned to face her, his eyes unreadable. "No." She stepped closer. The barn smelled of old hay and melting snow. She ran her hand along the smooth, clean wood of the new beam. "I was thinking maybe it should be something else now." "Like what?" she asked. "A pantry, a root cellar, maybe a cradle. Depends what the house needs next." She didn't laugh, but the hard lines around her mouth softened. Her fingers stopped their tracing and rested flat against the wood. "I don't want to be someone you rescued, Boaz," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not. I don't want your pity, or your charity." He set the hammer down on a bale of hay. "Have you ever seen me hand out either?" She looked at him then, really looked at him. Not the way a frightened woman sizes up a man, but the way a survivor looks at another survivor, trying to see the map of their scars. "I didn't come here to be yours," she whispered, "but I don't want to leave and forget you either." He took a step closer, just enough to close the space between them, enough for the cold air to feel warm. "I don't want you to be mine, Delaney," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I just want you to be here, if that's what you want." Her breath hitched. "Can you build something with someone," she asked, "when you're both still broken in places?" "That's the only way it holds," he said. That night they ate in a comfortable silence, a silence that filled the small cabin instead of emptying it. Later, She took down his wife's old wedding shawl from its hook by the window. She folded it gently and placed it in a wooden chest, not to erase the woman who had come before, but to make room for the woman who had come after. He saw her do it, but he said nothing. When he stepped out onto the porch for a breath of cold night air, he left the door open behind him. It was a small gesture, but she felt it like an invitation. She followed him out. The snow had stopped, and the moon had broken through the clouds, glazing the fields in a brittle, silver light. They stood side by side, looking out at the land. Not at what had been taken from them, but at what might still be built. "Boaz," she said after a long silence, if I really stayed, what would you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. He just watched the wind stir the snow in the pines. Then he turned to look at her, his gaze steady and sure. "A name on the deed, a cup on the shelf, a hand I can reach for when the night gets long." He paused. "Nothing more." She let out a sharp, trembling breath. "That's everything." He nodded once. Later, back in the warmth of the cabin, she sat by the fire, brushing her hair. And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide while doing it. Boaz sat in the chair across from her, just watching. Not to claim or to judge, just to witness. A small, real smile touched her lips, and that's when he reached under the table and slid a folded piece of paper toward her. A deed. Half the land, half the house, signed in his clear, strong hand. She stared at it, her eyes wide. "I didn't do anything to deserve this," she whispered. "No one ever does," he replied. "That's why it means something." The wind howled outside, but inside it was quiet. Her hands trembled as she took the paper and folded it carefully, placing it beside her plate. He didn't ask her if she would stay. He already knew. That night she slept in the bed, and he slept on the floor one last time, because some things need to be done with grace. But when she woke in the morning, he was there, lying on the bed beside her, fully clothed, his boots still on, his eyes open, watching the ceiling. She didn't pull away. They lay there for a long time, in the quiet of the new day. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind. "You ever think that some people were never meant to be saved? That maybe they just need to be held until they can stand up on their own?" He turned his head on the pillow and met her gaze. "That's the only kind I've ever trusted." The fire still crackled in the hearth. Outside, the fresh snow was a clean, untouched page. And inside, two people who had been lost for a very long time had finally landed. A home isn't always a place with walls. Sometimes it's just the quiet space that lets you heal. Sometimes it's the person who doesn't ask you to be anything other than what you are. And sometimes it's the red coat hanging by the door, a little worn, a little faded, but proof that you can walk through hell and come out whole on the other side. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and survival from the forgotten corners of history.